Living in Willowbrook Meadows was supposed to be a dream. Picturesque houses, perfectly manicured lawns, and friendly neighbors who waved at you while walking their dogs. But no one warned me about the real power in the neighborhood, the HOA. It all started with a letter. A letter that changed everything. Mrs. Harper, I read aloud, clutching the crisp piece of paper. Your lawn gnome violates HOA Regulation 14B, holiday decorations outside the seasonal window. What does that even mean? My husband, Dave, asked, glancing up from his crossword puzzle. It means, I said, waving the paper dramatically, that according to the HOA, our gnome in a Santa hat is a crime against humanity because it's March. To be fair, I had forgotten to take down the Santa hat after Christmas. But really, who had time to care about such things when work, kids, and binge-watching reality TV took priority? I'll take the hat off, I said, crumpling the letter. There. Problem solved. Little did I know, the HOA wasn't finished with me. A week later, another letter arrived. Mrs. Harper, I read aloud again, this time with growing irritation. The color of your mailbox flag does not comply with HOA-approved shades of red. Please repaint it with the enclosed paint sample. Dave snorted. What is this? The Stepford Wives. I groaned, holding up the tiny paint sample card labeled Regulation Red 43. I didn't even know there were 43 shades of red. I tried to comply. I really did. I bought the paint, repainted the mailbox flag, and even polished the mailbox for good measure. But the letters kept coming. Mrs. Harper, your lawn height exceeds 2.5 inches. Mrs. Harper, your trash cans were visible for 47 minutes after collection day. Mrs. Harper, your porch light bulb is emitting a warm yellow hue instead of HOA-approved soft white. It's like they're stalking us, I grumbled one evening, slapping another letter onto the growing pile. Dave raised an eyebrow. Maybe they are. Ever notice how Janice from the HOA always walks her dog past our house? And that's when it hit me. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were watching. The next morning, I spotted her. Janice, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. She was out with her Pomeranian, Snickers, strolling at a pace that screamed, I'm judging you. Her clipboard, always in hand, gleamed in the sunlight like a weapon of bureaucratic destruction. Good morning, Harper, she chirped as she passed my driveway. Lovely day, isn't it? I forced a smile. Sure is, Janice. Just perfect for walking your dog and observing the neighborhood. Oh, I don't observe, she said sweetly, flipping through her clipboard. I inspect. Keeps Willowbrook Meadows beautiful and compliant. I muttered something under my breath about compliance being overrated as she sauntered away. That night, as Dave and I sat on the couch with bowls of popcorn, I vented my frustration. She's got a clipboard, Dave. A clipboard. Who even carries those anymore? He shrugged, tossing a kernel in his mouth. Maybe you should beat her at her own game. Make our lawns so perfect she can't complain. Or, I said, narrowing my eyes, I could do the opposite. Dave paused mid-chew. What does that mean? It means, I said, a grin forming, if she wants to nitpick, let's give her something worth nitpicking. By the next afternoon, my plan was in motion. It started subtly. I swapped the boring soft white porch light for a bright pink bulb. Then, I placed a flamingo wearing bunny ears in the middle of the yard because why not? Don't you think this is a little much? Dave asked, watching as I added a plastic pumpkin next to the flamingo. Oh, this is just the beginning, I replied, arranging the pumpkin at a perfect angle. I call it seasonal fusion. Janice walked by later that evening, and I could feel her laser-like stare as she slowed to a crawl in front of my masterpiece. Interesting choice, Harper, she said, her pen poised over her clipboard. Thanks, Janice, I replied, giving her my best fake smile. Just trying to keep things festive. She said nothing, but the next morning, a letter arrived. Mrs. Harper, I read aloud at breakfast, your recent lawn decorations violate HOA Regulation 21D. Seasonal items must match the current calendar month. Please remove the flamingo, bunny ears, and pumpkin immediately. Wow, Dave said, shaking his head. She didn't even wait 24 hours. Perfect, I replied, grabbing a pen. because now I'm really going to have some fun. That weekend, I transformed our front yard into a chaotic wonderland. Flamingos multiplied, each one sporting a different seasonal accessory. Santa hats, Uncle Sam top hats, even tiny witch hats. A blow-up turkey stood proudly next to a 4th of July flag, and I topped it all off with a Happy Arbor Day banner strung between 2 trees. Dave stood on the porch, sipping his coffee and shaking his head. "You've officially lost it. Lost it," I said, stepping back to admire my work. I found my calling. When Janice walked by that evening, she stopped dead in her tracks. "Good evening, Janice," I said, waving cheerfully. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again as she frantically scribbled on her clipboard. This is outrageous." "Outrageously creative," I suggested. "This is a clear violation of HOA guidelines." "Which ones?" I asked innocently. "It's all seasonal, just a variety of seasons." Her face turned an alarming shade of red. "You'll be hearing from the HOA. I look forward to it," I called after her. The next letter wasn't a polite, "please comply" note. It was a full-blown HOA summons. "Mrs. Harper," it read, "you are hereby required to attend an HOA review meeting to address your numerous violations of community standards. Attendance is mandatory." "Makes it sound like I'm on trial," I muttered, tossing the letter onto the kitchen table. "To be fair," Dave said, sipping his coffee, "you did turn the yard into a circus." "It's not a circus," I corrected. "It's an artistic statement." The meeting was set for Friday evening, and by the time I arrived, the community center was packed. Janice stood at the front of the room, her clipboard held like a judge's gavel, while the other board members sat behind her in a semicircle of folding chairs. "Mrs. Harper," she began as I took my seat, "you've been summoned here to discuss your unique interpretation of seasonal decor." I plastered on my sweetest smile. "Thank you for noticing, Janice. I was going for inclusive festivity." She narrowed her eyes. "Inclusive festivity is not part of the HOA's guidelines. Our rules are designed to maintain harmony and order in the community." "Is harmony and order another word for boring?" I asked, earning a few muffled snickers from the back of the room. Janice's face twitched. "Mrs. Harper, your yard currently violates at least 12 HOA regulations, including but not limited to seasonal misalignment, excessive decoration density, and improper lawn ornament placement." "Improper ornament placement?" I repeated, struggling not to laugh. "Is there a diagram for that?" One of the board members coughed, clearly trying to hide a smile. Janice shot him a glare before continuing. "Your decorations are disruptive," she said, her voice rising. "They distract drivers and lower property values." "Oh, come on," I said, rolling my eyes. "If anything, I've increased property values by adding character. People love flamingos." The audience murmured in agreement, and Janice's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Enough," she snapped, slamming her clipboard onto the table. "The HOA demands that you remove all non-compliant decorations immediately, or face a fine." I crossed my arms. "How much of a fine?" $50. I raised an eyebrow. "That's it?" "Janice, I spend more than that on coffee in a week." The room erupted into laughter, and for the first time, Janice looked genuinely flustered. "Mrs. Harper," she hissed, "if you continue to defy HOA regulations, we will escalate enforcement." "Oh, I'm shaking," I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Janice glared at me, then at the audience. "This meeting is adjourned," she snapped, storming out of the room with Snickers trotting behind her. As I walked home, I couldn't help but feel victorious. Sure, Janice was furious, but the rest of the neighborhood seemed more amused than annoyed. "You're playing a dangerous game," Dave said when I told him what happened. "I'm not playing," I replied, grinning. "I'm winning." The next morning, a new letter arrived, taped dramatically to our front door. "Mrs. Harper," it read, "your continued defiance has forced the HOA to take additional measures. Effective immediately, a compliance officer will be assigned to monitor your property for further violations." Dave snorted. "A compliance officer?" What is this, Flamingo probation? Let them watch, I said, smirking. They're not ready for what's coming next. The HOA wasn't kidding about the compliance officer. The next morning, I spotted a gray sedan parked across the street. Inside sat a man in an ill-fitting suit, sunglasses, and a clipboard. Is that? Dave started, peering out the window. Oh, it's him, I said, grabbing my coffee. Our very own HOA spy. We watched as he scribbled something on his clipboard, glanced at my yard, and then made a call on his cell phone. What do you think he's reporting? Dave asked. Probably the Flamingo in the Uncle Sam hat, I replied. It's too patriotic for their tastes. Zoe, my teenage neighbor and newfound partner in crime, appeared on my porch later that day, holding a bag of gummy bears. Your yard's famous, she said, tossing a bear in her mouth. Everyone at school is talking about the Flamingo lady. Glad to know my rebellion is inspiring the next generation, I replied, grinning. What's the plan now? She asked, nodding toward the gray sedan. He's been there all morning. Oh, I've got plans, I said, sipping my coffee. Big plans? That evening, I set my masterpiece into motion. If the HOA wanted a war, I was going to give them one they'd never forget. First, I added more flamingos. But these weren't your average lawn flamingos. These were dressed up, customized, over-the-top flamingos. One wore a cowboy hat and boots. Another held a miniature surfboard. And the piece de resistance? A flamingo wearing a crown, perched atop a makeshift throne of cinder blocks. Next, I installed a string of multicolored lights around the yard, spelling out the words, Flamingo Freedom. Dave stood on the porch, arms crossed. You're going to break that poor compliance officer's brain. That's the idea, I replied, adjusting the lights. The next morning, the gray sedan was back, and the man in the ill-fitting suit looked visibly stressed. He stared at my yard for a solid 5 minutes before pulling out his clipboard and frantically writing. I think he's running out of boxes to check, Dave said, watching from the window. Good, I replied. Let him report this masterpiece. That afternoon, I received an email from Janice, the tone so passive-aggressive it practically dripped off the screen. Mrs. Harper, it read, your recent decorative choices are a clear violation of HOA regulations and community standards. If these items are not removed within 48 hours, the HOA will be forced to take legal action. Legal action? Over flamingos? I couldn't help but laugh. I think you've officially broken them, Dave said, reading over my shoulder. Not yet, I replied. But we're close. That evening, as the sun set and my multicolored lights flickered on, neighbors began stopping by to admire the chaos. This is incredible, one said, snapping a picture. Janice must be losing her mind, another added, laughing. Even Zoe showed up with a homemade sign that read, Support the Flamingo Revolution. As I stood on my lawn, surrounded by neighbors and the glow of my ridiculous display, I realized something. This wasn't just about the flamingos anymore. It was about standing up to pointless rules and having a little fun along the way. Janice and her clipboard didn't stand a chance. 2 days after my Flamingo Freedom masterpiece debuted, a new letter arrived. This time, it wasn't just a note from Janice. It was an official HOA summons complete with bold lettering and legalese. Failure to comply will result in fines, penalties, and potential legal proceedings, I read aloud, rolling my eyes. Dave smirked over his coffee. They're really pulling out the big guns. Good, I replied, slapping the letter onto the counter. Because I've got bigger guns. That afternoon, the gray sedan returned, but this time, the compliance officer wasn't alone. Janice herself stepped out of the passenger seat, clipboard in hand and Snickers trotting beside her. She was dressed like she was about to lead a military operation, complete with a visor and a jacket embroidered with the HOA logo. Oh, it's on now, I muttered, peeking through the curtains. What's she doing? Dave asked. Inspecting, I replied, mimicking her self-important tone. And plotting my demise. Janice paced my front yard, jotting down notes while the compliance officer stood awkwardly by her side. Occasionally, she'd point at a flamingo or my glowing Flamingo Freedom sign, shaking her head dramatically. Finally, She marched up to the door and rang the bell. "Mrs. Harper," she began when I opened it, "you've left us no choice but to escalate enforcement." "Enforcement has," I repeated, crossing my arms. "Effective immediately, you are required to remove all non-compliant decorations, or you will face daily fines of $100. I pretended to consider her words. Daily fines, you say?" Janice smirked, clearly thinking she'd won. "Yes. And we will pursue further legal action, if necessary." I leaned against the doorframe. "Janice, I have one question." She raised an eyebrow. "And what's that? Do you take Venmo?" "Because I'm not taking this down." The look on her face was priceless. She sputtered for a moment before snapping her clipboard shut. "This isn't over, Harper," she hissed, turning on her heel. "I'll be here," I called after her, grinning. That night, I gathered a group of neighbors in my backyard. Word of my battle with the HOA had spread, and everyone was eager to help. "This is more than just flamingos," Zoe declared, holding up her Flamingo Revolution sign. "This is about freedom." "She's right," said Mr. Thompson from down the street. "Janice has been harassing us for years. It's time we stand up to her." We worked late into the night, adding even more absurdity to my yard. By morning, the flamingos were joined by inflatable dinosaurs, a disco ball hanging from a tree, and a giant "Welcome to Fabulous Flamingo City" sign made from cardboard and glitter. Janice's head was going to explode. The next day, the gray sedan returned, but this time, it wasn't just Janice and the compliance officer. Half the HOA board was there, armed with clipboards and disapproving frowns. "Oh, look," I said, sipping my coffee. The cavalry's arrived. They stood on the curb, staring at my yard like it was a crime scene. Finally, Janice stormed up to the door, clipboard clutched like a weapon. "Mrs. Harper," she began, her voice shaking with fury, "this is an egregious violation of HOA standards. You've forced us to convene an emergency board meeting to discuss your—" "Janice," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "Relax. It's just flamingos." She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, something incredible happened. From down the street, a parade of neighbors began marching toward my house, each carrying their own lawn decorations. Flamingos, gnomes, windmills, and even a giant inflatable cow, they brought it all. "What is this?" Janice sputtered as the neighbors began planting their decorations in my yard. "It's called solidarity," Zoe said, grinning as she placed a sombrero-wearing flamingo next to the disco ball. Janice looked around, clearly overwhelmed. The other HOA board members exchanged nervous glances, and even the compliance officer seemed unsure of what to do. "You can't find the whole neighborhood," I said, folding my arms. Janice glared at me, her face turning an alarming shade of red. This isn't over," she muttered before storming back to her car. As the gray sedan sped away, the crowd erupted into cheers. "We'd won, at least for now. Flamingo City is here to stay," Zoe declared, holding up her sign. "And Janice can't handle it," I added, laughing. The next morning, Flamingo City was the talk of the neighborhood. People stopped by to take pictures, kids posed with the inflatable cow, and even Mr. O'Malley, who hadn't left his house in a year, peeked out to admire the chaos. "Mom, we're famous," Zoe shouted as she scrolled through her phone. "Look, #FlamingoCity is trending on social media." Sure enough, videos of our yard and the HOA's meltdown had gone viral. Comments poured in, ranging from "this is the kind of petty I aspire to" "Janice needs to chill." But not everyone was thrilled. Around noon, Janice showed up on my doorstep with 2 other HOA board members flanking her like backup singers. "Mrs. Harper," she said, clutching her clipboard like it was a shield, "this has gone far enough. Your yard is a spectacle, and it's embarrassing our community." "It's bringing us together," I countered, motioning toward the crowd of neighbors enjoying Flamingo City. Janice ignored me, waving her clipboard in the air. "We've drafted a new set of emergency HOA regulations. Effective immediately, inflatable animals, flamingos, and excessive decor are strictly prohibited." I raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to enforce that?" Her face twitched. The HOA reserves the right to confiscate non-compliant items. Confiscate? I laughed. Janice, are you planning to break into my yard and steal my flamingos? The neighbors, who had gathered around to eavesdrop, burst into laughter. Someone shouted, "Good luck catching the cow." Janice's eye twitched, and she turned on her heel. Mark my words, Harper. This isn't over. That evening, I called an emergency meeting of my own. Dozens of neighbors crammed into my backyard, each one carrying a lawn ornament or decoration. "They're trying to take Flamingo City from us," I said, pacing in front of the inflatable cow. "But we're not going down without a fight." "Yeah." Zoe cheered, holding up her Flamingo Freedom sign. "So here's the plan," I continued. "If they want to take down Flamingo City, they'll have to take all of us down. Tomorrow we're expanding." The next morning, Flamingo City spilled into the entire block. Every yard was decorated with flamingos, gnomes, and inflatable animals. One neighbor even strung Christmas lights across their hedges that blinked the words, HOA Who. Janice, predictably, lost her mind. She marched up and down the street, clipboard in hand, barking orders at anyone who would listen. "You're all in violation," she shouted. "The HOA will not stand for this." But the HOA had underestimated us. As the day went on, more and more neighbors joined in. Even people from nearby neighborhoods showed up with decorations to add to the chaos. By mid-afternoon, the local news had arrived. A reporter stood in front of my yard, microphone in hand, as the camera panned across the spectacle. "So tell us," the reporter said, turning to me, "why are you doing this?" "Because," I said, smiling for the camera, "sometimes you have to fight back against ridiculous rules. And what better way to do it than with flamingos?" The broadcast aired that evening, and the internet went wild. Flamingo City was officially a phenomenon, and Janice, well, let's just say she wasn't handling it well. The next morning, a final letter arrived. This one was typed, embossed with the HOA's official seal, and signed by every member of the board, except Janice. "Dear Mrs. Harper," it began, "after careful consideration, the HOA has decided to rescind all recent fines and regulations regarding Flamingo City. We also regret to inform you that Janice is chosen to step down from her position as HOA president." I stared at the letter, hardly believing what I was reading. "We did it," I whispered. Zoe hooped, running around the yard with her sign. "Flamingo Freedom Forever." Dave just shook his head, smiling. "I can't believe you actually won." That evening, as the sun set over Flamingo City, I stood in my yard, surrounded by neighbors and decorations, feeling a deep sense of victory. "Think this'll finally stop the HOA?" Dave asked, joining me on the porch. "Maybe," I said, sipping my lemonade. "But if not, I've got a great idea for Thanksgiving turkey display." The crowd erupted into laughter, and for the first time, Willowbrook Meadows truly felt like home. In the weeks following Janice's resignation, life in Willowbrook Meadows returned to something resembling normalcy. Well, as normal as it could be, with a giant inflatable cow still proudly standing in the Thompsons' yard and Zoe's Flamingo Freedom sign permanently mounted on her porch. The HOA, under its new leadership, sent out a notice that they were revising several outdated regulations. In plain English, it meant they were backing off, probably to avoid another Flamingo City uprising. One morning, I was watering the flower beds when Mrs. Connors from 3 houses down stopped by. She was holding a bright pink flamingo, wearing a tiny sun hat. "I thought you might like this," she said, handing it over. "Thanks, Mrs. Connors," I said, grinning. "Flamingo City can always use another citizen." "It's the least I could do," she replied, looking sheepish. "You know, Janice once fined me for leaving my recycling bin out for 10 minutes too long." "I'm glad you stood up to her." I nodded, placing the flamingo in a prime spot next to the mailbox. That afternoon, Zoe and I held an official Flamingo City award ceremony in the yard. And the award for Best Flamingo Accessories goes to Mr. O'Malley for his flamingo in a sombrero, Zoe announced, holding up a makeshift trophy made of glitter and duct tape. The neighborhood erupted into cheers, and Mr. O'Malley, who rarely left his porch, waved shyly. "Your speech, sir?" Zoe asked, shoving the trophy into his hands. He cleared his throat. Thanks for the glitter thing. And, keep up the good work. It was the most anyone had heard him say in years. Later that evening, as I sat on the porch sipping iced tea, Dave joined me. So, what's next for the Flamingo lady? He asked, smirking. I laughed. Well, I've been thinking about a giant inflatable turkey for Thanksgiving. Maybe some penguins for winter. Keep the HOA on their toes. He shook his head, grinning. You're unbelievable. Maybe, I said, raising my glass, but at least now I've got the whole neighborhood behind me. And so, Flamingo City remained a symbol of freedom, laughter, and the power of standing up to ridiculous rules. Sure, life in Willowbrook Meadows wasn't perfect, but it was ours. And as long as there were flamingos on the lawn, it felt like home. What would you do if your HOA tried to take over your yard? Would you fight back like we did, or play by the rules? Share your funniest HOA stories in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more hilarious tales.